Okay, last week we learned a method that is used literally hundreds of times in the Talmud, and that is called in English, don't read it that way, read it this way, where the sages, they took a word or a part of a verse, and either by changing the punctuation or adding a letter or subtracting a letter, they changed the meaning of what seems to be the simple literal meaning. It doesn't change the literal meaning, but it adds a new dimension. And that's what we did last week. And as I said, hundreds of times in the Talmud, this method is used. It's one of the most creative of all of the methods because it really takes a creative mind to kind of play with the letters and the words to get deeper meanings. So this week we're actually continuing, but we're doing it from later generations. In other words, this method was, like I said, so creative and was so inviting for later commentaries to use the same method. So this chapter, for those who are following it in the book, is chapter 23, and it's called An Ongoing Method of Derash. In other words, the same method, but extended until our very day. So we're going to learn some just beautiful, deep, wonderful, different examples of this method. So we're going to start, again, for those who are following it, on page 213. And this is an extremely important drasha from the Baal Shem Tov. And it's on Parshat Noach, in the instructions that Noach gets for building the ark. And so what appears to be simple directions of quite literally how to build the ark, the Baal Shem Tov gave over one of his most important teachings. So for those who want to follow, it's chapter 6, verse 16 in Bereshit, in Genesis. And it says like this, Sohar ta'aseh l'teva, make for yourself a window in the ark. Ve'el ama techalenu milamala, and the window should go up to an amma is this measurement from the elbow to the end of the finger. It's like 1.5 feet. And you should finish the window 1.5 feet below the top of the ark. Upetach hateva b'tzida tasim, and make an opening in the side of the ark. A lower tachtiim shniim shlishim ta'aseh, a bottom floor, a middle floor, and a top floor. So these are literal, simple instructions of how to build the ark. So the Baal Shem Tov came and he gave over, there's two parts of it. He gave over one of his most important teachings. And where this teaching is found, remember, the Baal Shem Tov didn't write any books himself. His students compiled his teachings and they started to spread his teachings. And different books of his teachings came out. So there is a book called the Baal Shem Tov Ala Torah, the Baal Shem Tov's Torahs on the Chumash, on the 5 books of Moses. And in the Parsha of Noach, there is approximately a 90-page section called Amud HaTefilah, the pillar of prayer, based on what we're going to say right now. In other words, this seemingly short Torah that the Baal Shem Tov gives over became the basis for all of his teachings about prayer, which were extensive. The Baal Shem Tov innovated many, many different advices of how to pray in a deep, joyous, profound, spiritual manner. So how did he interpret this verse? So we'll go back to the beginning. Sohar ta'aseh lateva. So the word in Hebrew for ark is teva, but it also has a different meaning, which is word. A word in Hebrew is called a teva. And a sohar is a window. But the word sohar comes from the word to shine. Sohar is very close to Zohar. The fundamental book of Kabbalah is called the Zohar, which means to illuminate, to shine. So look what the Baal Shem Tov explains here. Instead of reading it, make a window in your ark, he said, make your words of Torah and Tefillah shine. In other words, it can't be by rote. It can't be just an automatic kind of prayer. You have to make the words of your prayers and the way you're learning Torah to shine. And then it continues, Ve'el amma techalena milamala. This measurement, the amma, is written Aleph Mem Hey. But if you change the Hey to an Aleph, it's Ima, mother. Who is the mother image? The Shekhinah, God's divine presence. So the Baal Shem says that when you're praying and you're making the words of Torah and prayer shine, direct them to your mother, to the Shekhinah above, milamala. And then he says, and then in the side of your teva, you should make an opening. So he says, so if you make the words of Torah and Tefillah shine, then it will open up a gate that will connect you directly with God. And then he finishes the verse, a lower floor, a middle floor, and an upper floor. And this is something we discussed in the last week or two, that the Baal Shem explained that every letter in the Torah has three different levels: worlds, souls, and divinity. That every letter has a manifestation in the physical material world. Every letter has a manifestation in the way it affects and reflects the soul. And every letter is a divine channel from God to shine forth his light and energy into the world. So it's just astounding what the Baal Shem Tov did here with this verse. Because if you just read the verse, it sounds like it's instructions to build the teva. But he took it, and that became the foundation of all of his teachings about prayer. And like I said in the book, the Baal Shem Tov Al HaTorah, there's 90 pages, all from his students. His students transmitted his different teachings about prayer. So that's what we're going to start with. This is really one of the most fundamental uses of this methodology of the Baal Shem took most of the words of that verse, and he didn't superimpose a different meaning, it's the meaning is in the words. The word for ark is the word for word. And the word for a window is to shine. And a lower floor and a middle floor and a top floor are these three levels on which everything in the world is really arranged, put it that way. So that's our first example, a very, very important example. Now, we're going to do another one for the Baal Shem Tov. This is on the next page, the bottom of 214 and 215. When we came out of Egypt and we crossed the Reed Sea, and of course we sang this incredible song, and people had a mass prophetic experience all together. Everyone sang together. And then it says in the Torah that they left the Reed Sea. They're on their way to the Mount Sinai. And it says they went 3 days without water. You can die going 3 days without water. And so, of course, the people like, what are we going to drink? And so the Torah explains that they came to a place called Mara. From the word mar means bitter. And the words in the Torah says that they came to this place and they couldn't drink the water. Why? Ki marim hem, because the waters were bitter. They were bitter waters. It wasn't drinkable. So God showed Moshe a tree, and he said, throw the tree in the water and it will sweeten the waters. And Moshe did that, and they were able to drink from the waters. So like every story in the Torah, this is an archetypal story that is going on here. And what's interesting, it doesn't say throw a branch in the water. It says throw a tree in the water. So in Kabbalah and Chassidut, it's explained which tree is this? The tree of life. So the tree of life has the power to sweeten all reality. That's the symbolism here. But what we're going to concentrate is on the words ki marim hem. The waters were bitter. So the Baal Shem Tov, Bracha, we're going to take later. I'm going to read your chats. I see you just wrote a chat. I hope everyone doesn't mind, but we always leave a good almost hour afterwards for discussion. I'm always afraid of getting off track. So Bracha, please be patient, and we will talk afterwards, okay? So the Baal Shem Tov, he read the exact same words, but he didn't read it that way. He read it this way. Because when you read it, the inclination is they couldn't drink the waters because ki marim hem, because the waters were bitter. The Baal Shem Tov says, no, the word hem, them, is not going on the water, it's going on the people. Why couldn't they drink the water? Because the people were bitter. And because they were bitter, they experienced the water as being bitter. What were they bitter about? Here they had just witnessed over a year's time 10 plagues, miracles left and right. They crossed the Red Sea, this huge miracle. They're saved from Egypt. They have this prophetic experience of singing the song in unison. And then they go 3 days without water. And it's like, it was such a shock for them. It's like, aren't these miracles just going to continue and continue? Like, how can it be that we're almost dying of thirst? What's going on here? So they became somewhat bitter. Another explanation is that when the Egyptians were drowned, so the booty came upon the shore, and they got so involved with the picking up the booty, they kind of lost track of, we're on our way to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. So what's interesting is, from this incident, we learn a very, very important part of Jewish law and custom is because they went 3 days without water. And if you remember, in a previous chapter, we learned that the sages said in the chapter on code words, any place it says water, it's an allusion to Torah itself. So in other words, you could read this, not just that they went 3 days without physical water, but they went 3 days without Torah because they were so involved with the booty. They went 3 days without water. Based on this story, it became tradition that we don't go more than 3 days without publicly reading the Torah. We read it on Mondays, Thursdays, and Shabbat. So never is there a time when more than 3 days go by without reading the Torah publicly. So again, this is based on this drasha from the Baal Shem, who instead of reading it one way, the way that most people read it, and this time he didn't even change the words at all. He just explained it's not the waters that were bitter, it's the people who are bitter. And from this really comes one of the most important teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, which is if you think good, it will be good. In other words, since they were bitter, they experienced the waters as being bitter. Okay, so that's our second example. The third one is on page 218 in the middle. And this is one that is a very important one because it's part of our daily prayers. We're told that we should say the 145th Psalm three times every day. It goes according to the Hebrew letters. And when it gets to the letter Peh, it's Poteach et Yadecha umazbia l'kol chai ratzon. We're directing our words to God, and we say, open up your hand and satisfy the needs of all of your creation. So Poteach et Yadecha, open up your hand. So it says in the Tikkunei Zohar, it says, don't read it, open up your hand. Now the word in Hebrew for hand is yad, yud daled, yad. Now that's very, very close to the Hebrew letter yud. So the Tikkunei Zohar says, don't read it, open up your hand. Read it, open up the power of the letter yud that is in your hand. Now, what does that mean though? So yud, hopefully everyone can imagine it, yud is the smallest of the letters. And the expression used in the Talmud for the letter yud is the little that holds a lot. It's the littlest letter, but it holds a lot. Why do they say that? Because we've discussed many times, but I'll do it very quickly, the idea of tzimtzum, that before creation, there was just the infinite light of God. There was no time, no space, nothing else other than God. And for God to create a physical finite world, he had to contract his infinite being, as it were, in order to make a place for the world. This is what's called tzimtzum, or contraction. So the letter Yud represents this energy of tzimtzum. That's why they called it the little that holds a lot. And so what we're asking of God is, God, everything is in your hand. So not just open up your hand, but since the letters of the Torah are the building blocks of creation, so all of this energy that's in the Yud, and this I will comment on. Bracha's writing like crazy here, all of her chats, which she points out, rightfully so, that the two hands are 10 fingers. And Yud, of course, is the 10th letter. So Yud and 10 and Yad go together. So here we're asking God, open up your ability to give. You can do everything, God. So please open up your hand, but here, open up your Yud, the power of Yud that's in the world. Okay, the next one is, it's really one of my favorites. It's really one of my absolute favorites. And this is part of the Haggadah of Pesach. Near the end of the Haggadah, this is on page 218, near the end of the Haggadah, after doing the blessing after the meal, then it's customary to open the door and to invite Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu, to come in. Of course, we're getting towards the end of the Seder, and we're moving into our hope and our dream and our desire for the Messianic era. And by tradition, Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet, will come before the Mashiach and announce the coming of Mashiach. So this is a very high point of the Seder. But at this point, there's a certain passage that we say, which is, it begins, Shvoch chamatcha al hagoyim asher lo yaducha. The usual translation is, pour out your wrath on all of the nations that do not know you. And it continues, and have tried to destroy the Jewish people. So the first thing we have to clarify, because it's very, very important, that this is not talking about the whole world. This is directed towards those nations that have tried to destroy us. And so here, before Mashiach is coming, so the simple reading is, God, pour out your wrath. In other words, it's time for an accounting here. All those who have tried to destroy the Jewish people, they should receive what's coming to them. It sounds very, very harsh. So the Kotzker Rebbe said an amazing thing, really, really amazing thing. The word for wrath, chamatcha, the root of it is cham, which means hot, warm. So the Kotzker Rebbe says, Rabbanu Sha'olam, Master of the world, pour out your warmth on the nations, that they will come to love your people. Pour out your warmth that everyone can do tshuva. Pour out your warmth and bring the Mashiach already. So it's just, here you have almost the opposite meaning. Is it wrath or is it warmth? So I had this experience, I'm just sharing with you. If you saw the movie, you'll understand what I'm talking about. If not, you should see this movie. It's called Inglorious Bastards. If anyone has seen this movie, it's called Inglorious Bastards. It's a fiction movie, and it takes place during World War II. And I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but there's a certain scenario in the story where the entire German leadership, including Hitler, they came to this ceremony, and there is a plot to destroy the entire German leadership. And in the movie, they actually succeed. Again, it's a fiction movie. And when I first saw this movie, I didn't know what was coming. But when they were able to destroy the whole German leadership, which in theory would have put an end to World War II and all of the suffering, there was I had, not just me personally, I talked to a lot of people with the same feeling. There was this deep feeling of like joy that evil was wiped out. And this is very, very connected to the whole story of Purim. We're told that you're supposed to drink on Purim ad lo yada, until you don't know. But what's the continuation? Ad lo yada bein arur Haman v'borach Mordechai. You don't know what you should be more joyous for, that Haman was destroyed or Mordechai was elevated and the Jews were saved. So it's like what we're being told is there's a place for both of it, both of these things. There's a place, and again, if you see the movie, I think you'll understand what I'm talking about. There's this, it's a very, very deep emotion after everything the Jewish people have gone through. Again, it's a fiction movie, but still, it's like, wow, if they could have killed Hitler, like what a different world it would be. And you should know that actually there were many attempts on his life. And if any of them would have succeeded, it would have saved tens, not just Jews, but it would have saved tens of millions of people of dying. You know that close to 100 million people died in World War II? 100 million. It's mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. So here, don't read it that way, read it this way. God, if you have to pour out your wrath, pour out your wrath. But we're asking you, pour out your warmth and let that change the world. So every year when we get to this part of the Seder, I can't forget this Torah. Okay. The next one is on 219, another one from the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov was a master of this method, where don't read it that way, read it this way. So it says in the Gemara, there's a whole discussion. How much do the stars affect us? How much of astrology is worth paying attention to? And this is it's a very, very fine line. I should mention that the typical astrology that's out there, like you look in the paper, anyone who's born between this day and this day, this is your horoscope for the day. according to Jewish belief, that we don't touch that, we don't go near that. And the idea that we should consult the stars to determine what choices we should make in life, that also is forbidden. That's considered a forbidden practice. Yet, quite paradoxically, the Talmud is full of astrological, I'll call it wisdom or discussions. In other words, the sages understood that there is a certain influence of the stars on human beings. It's even part of our prayers that we acknowledge that God, the stars are somewhat like angels, meaning they are channels through which God partly runs the world. So in the Gemara, it says, Ein mazal liYisrael. There is no influence of the stars on Israel. But again, you have all these discussions in the Gemara admitting to that there is a certain influence of the stars. So the Baal Shem Tov came and said, again, the same words, but he just changes the way we say it. Instead of Ein Mazal Yisrael, he said it, Ayin Hu HaMazal Yisrael, meaning the Ein Sof, the infinite one. God is the ruling influence over the Jewish people. And so the teaching is that if we're connected to God, then the stars do not rule over us. If we're not connected to Torah and the Creator, then it's implied that the stars do have an influence. They do have an influence. So this is a very, very important teaching from the Baal Shem Tov. Instead of there's no influence of the stars on Israel, he changes it to meaning God, the Ein Sof, that is the influence over Israel. And as long as we're connected to the infinite one, then the influence of the stars do not rule over us. So that's another very, very important one. The next one is a really interesting one and is easy to be misunderstood. And that's why this drasha is so important. It says in the Gemara, Eza Isha Kshera, who is a kosher woman? Ha'oseh Ratzon Ba'ala, a woman who does the will of her husband. In other words, a woman who does what her husband tells her to do. That's how you could possibly read it. Now, obviously, in today's world, that doesn't go very far, that kind of a reading. But the beautiful drasha that's made on this is, first of all, Eza Isha Kshera. You could read it the same letters, but reading it a little bit different. Eza Isha Kshera, a woman ki Sarah, instead of ki Kishara, Kisara. Same letters, but instead of a shin, a sin. So who is a kosher woman? A woman like Sarah. Now, what do we say about Sarah's relationship with Avram? So when there was a disagreement between Sarah and Avram as to what to do with Yishmael, Avraham was very reluctant to send Yishmael away. And Sarah insisted on it. God came to Avram and said, everything that Sarah is telling you, listen to her voice. And from that, we learn, Rashi brings this, that Sarah was considered greater than Avram in prophecy, because she saw far into the future what would happen between these two sons. And so she said, right now we have to send him away. And God said, listen, Avram, listen to what your wife is telling you. So that's one, explanation of who is a kosher woman, a woman like Sarah. But to take it one step deeper, what does it mean, oseh ratzon ba'ala, who does the will of her husband? So if you look at the account of creation, so the last words, the end of the first account of creation is Shabbat. And it ends, Asher bara Elokim la'asot, that God made to do. Everyone asks, well, that last word it seems redundant. That God made to do, what does it mean? La'asot. La'asot is from the word oseh. And it's explained, it means litaken, to fix, and even deeper, to become a partner with God. This is the last word of creation. And we're told in a certain way, it's like one of the most important, because what it's saying is God did not finish creation. He left it for human beings to become a partner with him in fixing the world. So now if you take that same thing with our expression here, ha'oseh ratzon ba'ala, who does the will of her husband, what it actually means is who fixes the will of her husband. So who is a kosher woman? A woman who fixes her husband, fixes the will of her husband. So it's a very, very beautiful explanation, and it is it's quite true. It is quite true. Okay, on page 221. So this is also a very, very good one in Pirkei Avot. So in Pirkei Avot it says, Ukinei lecha chaver. You should acquire for yourself a friend, a chaver. What does that mean? It's in the context of learning Torah. Ukinei lecha chaver. So it's usually understood, even if you have to pay to have a study partner, or to have someone who can guide you in your learning. It's a very worthy thing to do. Acquire for yourself a friend. It doesn't have to be even with money, but in other words, make sure you have someone to learn with, someone who can bounce back and forth ideas with. It's a very, very important part of learning. And as we know, the yeshiva system is based on what are called chavruta, chavrutot, from the same word chaver. It means study partners, where in most yeshivas, most of the time is taken up in pairs of learning, where they either prepare or review the teachings of the teacher. The teacher will teach for an hour a day, an hour and a half a day. And then the rest of the time, the students are either preparing for the next lesson or reviewing what they just learned. So the Alter Rebbe, this is a long story. I'm not going to tell the whole story, but the daughter of the Alter Rebbe had a young son. His name was Menachem Mendel, which also became a very, very popular name in Chabad. The Alter Rebbe is formed the Hasidic dynasty of Chabad. And his daughter passed away at a very young age. And her last will and testament really was that her father should raise her son. It's a long story, which I'm not going to tell the whole thing now. And so she passed away. And the Alter Rebbe raised this young boy from the age of like 2 years old or even younger. And he eventually became the third Chabad Rebbe. So when, and the Alter Rebbe learned with him every single day, one-on-one. But he interpreted Uknei Lecha Chaver. So the word Uknei, also, again, if you change the emphasis a little bit, is Ukaneh. A kaneh is a quill. That's what they used to write with. It was a kaneh. So he read it. Actually, before I say it, I want to go back. Other people explain, what does it mean, acquire for yourself a friend? So many say, in learning, your best friend are books. You should acquire many, many, many books so you'll have what to learn from. But the Alter Rebbe added a third understanding, and he said, a quill will be to you a friend. In other words, it's important to take notes. It's important to write down your ideas. So I believe that Tzemach Tzedek was around 8 years old when his grandfather told him this Torah. And it's quite amazing. For the rest of his life, he wrote every single day, except for Shabbos, but right after Shabbos on Saturday night, he would write, and he wrote approximately 30 pages every day, taking notes on what he was learning and his own novel ideas. And when he passed away, there were tens of thousands of pages of handwritten notes from the Tzemach Tzedek. In his day, he published very little. And so many of the books that came out later were later students who took these notes and they turned them into the teachings of the Tzemach Tzedek. They weren't just notes. He wrote out his Torahs. Remember, there were no computers then. There were no MP3s. There was no dictation. A person had his quill and a piece of paper. So I only learned this like 2 or 3 years ago, but it was so meaningful for me because I've been doing this, certainly not 30 pages a day, and certainly not every day, but over the last 40 years, I have scores of notebooks, hundreds of files, where I I write down my classes. In fact, I mean, right here, I'm doing this. I always have my little pieces of paper that I'm learning from. So, and when I started to do this, it was before there were computers. And to this day, I'm still taking notes on when I get an idea or I learn something that I want to remember. I always write it down. And I always encourage people that if you have a innovative idea, write it down. Because if you don't write it down, 3 days later, it's like, oh, I had this great idea. What was it? You can't always remember. But if you write it down right then you got it. And usually I just write like kind of shorthand. But usually it's enough to remind myself, and then I write it out more. And virtually all of my books have come from handwritten notes. Virtually all of them actually have come. And so I encourage everyone to do this. Okay, so that's a very nice place to stop. And we'll end with the bracha I just gave everyone. First of all, that everyone has innovative ideas. Everyone has novel ideas. And so don't sell yourself short when you have one thinking, oh, okay, what do I have to remember this for? You never know. You never know. Write it down, even in shorthand, so you have the ideas that come to you. Because when they come to you, they're usually coming from a higher place than just the mind. They're coming from a much higher place that we're drawing down.